I guess the first question that might be on folks' mind is why am I looking at a season retrospective of the French Alps when I'm sitting in on an ESOL group of lectures? I think Frank asked me to present because we had such an interesting season out here, and there's quite a lot of crossovers and learning points that are mirrored in what's been happening in America in the last season, and some interesting phenomena that are worth kind of bearing in mind, some behaviors and some snowpack issues. So let's dive straight in. And as Frank alluded to, it was a particularly bad season here in Europe. I know in the States as well. It was a particularly bad year as well. I think he had 37 fatalities in the US last year. And in France alone, we had 40. And in neighboring countries, I think the total figure was considerably higher. And the reason for that were a number of things. We had a really unusual snowpack in so much as we had a sand event that came through in early February. And then we had a setup of depth tour that set up early in the season in a classic way and really didn't go away for large parts of the French Alps. And under the umbrella, this was all happening under the umbrella of COVID restrictions. And I'll explain more what I mean about that. So the restrictions that we had here in France were particularly restrictive, and that certainly played in on some of the behaviors by people going out skiing and recreating what they could and what they couldn't do, and where they were being forced to recreate. So just as a snapshot there, you can see on the far right is the figure of 40 deaths. And you can see the trend, like a lot of the world has been going down over recent years. There's some outliers there. You can kind of dismiss in so much as some of them are infrastructure failures, multiple casualties that aren't necessarily recreational skiers, housing being hit, certainly back there in the late 60s and early 80s, that's definitely the case. So we spiked, we're about 50% with 40 fatalities. We're about 50% above what we would normally expect in the French Alps in a normal winter. Some of the figures that I'll be talking about are fairly mind-blowing. You need to put these figures in the context of the density of population that recreate in the mountains here. It's quite a large percentage. It's a mainstream sport to go ski touring, to go snowshoeing. It's not an outlying sport at all. So we have large population bases putting large volumes of people into the mountains. So you need the context of that as well. But we're about 50% above what we'd normally expect to see fatality-wise in a normal winter season. And that's the breakdown of it there. Large amount of incidents, large amount of fatalities, 135 incidents. And when by talking about incidents, these are reported incidents that have been logged by authorities. So they've necessitated an emergency call in to a first responder of some description. And that's been recorded there. So it doesn't count all of those dozens, hundreds of incidents that people have got away with, near misses, involvements. Certainly we'll talk about a couple of involvements that I had or I was witness to this winter that wouldn't have been included in those figures. So again, huge numbers, but we need to keep that in context of the huge numbers of incidents and accidents, but with a vast amount of people going up. And that was particularly notable this year because some of these restrictions are so restrictive, people start to do all kinds of weird things. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But just to give you guys a little context of where we're talking about and what we're going to be talking about. So here's a map of Europe, and you can see this is the area here that we're talking about. It's referred to as the Western Alps. And the prevailing weather directions are coming from the northwest. Our storms to this part of the Alps come in from this northwest stream, generally coming cold, but we get secondary weather patterns coming up from the south that generally pile into this part of the Alps. It's an intermountain snowpack that we have. Further east you go in the Alps, over towards Austria and to the east of Switzerland, it has more continental aspects. But where we are, we're on an intermountain kind of snowpack. So that gives you some kind of mindset of what kind of snow we're dealing with here. And the area in particular that we're going to be talking about is around Mont Blanc. So the border between France and Italy it runs right through Mont Blanc along this chain here. And to the left, we have France, to the right, we have Italy, and to the north, we have Switzerland. We're at the confluence of three countries. And again, this plays into some of the behaviors that happened in the Alps this year. And around here, Montjoli, this is kind of where a lot of the skiing that I did this season got done. So I've kind of talked about France's COVID restrictions, and we went into a secondary lockdown here in mid-October, and all French ski lifts closed. But interestingly, just across the border, Switzerland kept their lifts turning. In addition to that, we were under curfew, but perhaps the biggest influence on people's behavior in the mountain was this ban on travel. You weren't allowed to move more than about 15 miles from your home address to recreate. So that had a profound influence of where people could go to chase snow, to chase conditions, and to chase terrain. Now, bear in mind that lifts were also closed, so all of those recreational skiers that would normally run the lifts were going out and buying ski touring equipment and then ski touring within the local vicinity. So vast amounts of inexperienced skiers in the mountains, and people being funneled into areas which they may not necessarily go. And for the regular locals, they were now looking for conditions and snow and terrain that they were having to share with vast numbers of other people for the first time. So they themselves were getting displaced into more remote and potentially not desirable ski areas to find virgin snow, to find clean snow and quiet ski runs. So we can already see how these COVID restrictions are affecting people's behaviors just by these restrictions. Here's a timeline of what happened in the Western Alps. And by the Western Alps, I'm talking about that area of Mont Blanc region with Switzerland just to our north. Verbier is maybe 15, 20 minutes drive, half an hour's drive from the French border. As the crow flies, probably 30, 40 miles from Chamonix. And I'm including the Italian side in this Western Alps as well. And at the bottom left, you can see here the season totals. France is 40 deaths, Switzerland just over the border, 32, and Italy just over the border, 27. So just within this concentrated area of three countries, we're talking in the region of what's that, about 90 deaths, is it? What's that, 70, yeah, 40, 60, 100 deaths, just within that region in this winter. So we'll keep popping back to this timeline, but let's just kind of get into it. It kind of started early, as it often does, up high, and the first kind of incident report of avalanche involvement happened really early in the season, just after one of the first snowfalls, when 5 guides and professional skiers were all out together as a group and got themselves avalanched just on the Italian side. And classic early season avalanche in so much as the injury profile involved fractures and injuries to limbs from being dragged through shallow snowpacks and through rocks. And this was a portent of the season to happen. You could argue this was also a behavior that may or may not have been influenced by some of these restrictions coming in. And I say it's not, because people going up and skiing these high peaks after a first snowfall is quite common here. But secondly, I say it could have been because the countries were closing borders. You're not supposed to move between France and Italy. You're not supposed to move between France and Switzerland. So this may have played unconsciously or subconsciously of, well, there's lifts turning in Italy. They're going to close down in a week or two. Let's go get a run over there. Conditions may not be optimal. I don't know. I'm surmising on that, but this was the first incident that happened early in the season. Around that snowfall that we had end of October there, as with a lot of snowfalls around the world, certainly we're maybe seeing that in the Western states right now. These early season snowfalls in October are kind of an avalanche forecaster's bogeyman, in so much that people get pretty stoked about getting early season turns, but we kind of worry about what that early season snow on north steep shady aspects are going to do. And because that snow will just sit there, it won't get any more snow on top of it for a while, and that snow starts to rot out, right? And so we got that snowfall and around the 8,000 feet area, and went up to have a look at that. And interestingly, that snow wasn't doing that there, but around 8,000 feet, below 8,000 feet, the snow that was on the ground, because of temperature inversions, it started to, it was quite warm up high where the snow had fallen. That snow started to melt and consolidate. But if you went much higher again, it was staying and starting to facet. It was staying cold and it was faceting out. So we're starting to see right from the very beginning of the season, two quite different snowpacks starting to establish themselves initially. Below 8,000 meters, that early snow turned to an ice crystal form, and above 8,000 feet, it started to facet. So there's just, you can see there, about 8,000 feet, this snow here became icy and very solid. And the season just kind of set off as in a normal way. The lifts don't start turning anyway in France till middle to late December, but they weren't going to run at all this year. And for a lot of our season, we skied in what was resort. We pushed into the backsides of these resorts where it was gladed, and we were getting some very nice snow early on in the season. Very little or to no avalanche danger, because all we had was a single depth of a foot of snow, powder, crystalline snow on that, some cases on that hard icy base, but nice skiing and just a general start to the a normal start to the season. However, above that, there was already from higher resorts where people were touring, and on the Swiss side where the lifts had started to run, we're getting reports coming in of avalanches popping down to those faceted layers from the month before, from the end of October. People were starting to pop off little slabs into the basal layers, which was faceting away and starting to turn into depth fall down there. But where we were lower than 8,000 feet, we were getting very stable conditions. And there's an example there. If you've not got experience of reading a snow profile, then I definitely encourage you to take a level 1, level 2, and spend a little bit of time delving into some of these profiles, because they're quite useful in getting a snapshot of the snowpack for a particular area on an aspect at an elevation. And I'll not go in and explain how they work if you're not in any great depth, but you can see at the bottom there, we have the hardness of the snow, fist, 4 fingers, 1 finger, pencil and knife, that's the hardness. And then we have the depth of the snow here. And off to the right, we have the crystal type. So we can see down on the basal layers, and we're below 8,000 feet, we've got a kind of an icy form with a few facets above it, a little sandwich there. And then we've got about 1 meter of snow in total depth. And over here, we've got a compression test saying that on the 27th hit on the compression test, there was a resistant planer, an RP released at 35 centimeters off from the ground. So certainly this is a layer of concern lower down, but it was pretty stable. We weren't getting much of any interest. It was just starting off as a pretty normal winter at this stage. Snow kept coming down, little and often, just how we liked it. And we were getting some good skiing. It was nice. It was setting up nicely. But again, from further north, 50, 60 miles away, over that border in Switzerland, we were getting reports of these dumps of snow setting off avalanches down into those basal faceted layers. And already from Switzerland, fatality reports were starting to drift in, which is kind of interesting because we were seeing very little where we were 50 miles away, because our resorts around where we were skiing were that much lower. And remember what I said about the travel restrictions, is people, even if they knew that the snowpack conditions were safer in where we were 50 miles further south, they were restricted to come to us. There was, as these deaths started to mount up, it's kind of an interesting snapshot into the mindset of different cultures and how they view things. There was an interview with a French colonel from the PGHM, the government police mountain rescue that they have in the high mountains here, and he was being interviewed about fatalities starting of ski tours happening in COVID, and there was a certain degree of concern, I said, about people that had very little or no backcountry or touring experience going into the resorts, where there was little bits of control going on within the grounds of the resorts, but not much. It certainly wasn't a protected area like it would be in the States. The way patrol in a normal winter in Europe will mitigate avalanches is to protect the peace, not necessarily protecting everything inside the boundary of the ski resorts. They'll only look to protect the peace. However, this winter just gone, because of the restrictions and the peace weren't running, the only mitigation that was going on was done to protect infrastructure, mountain huts, the lift lines themselves. So it's not that there was no control going on, but it was very haphazard, certainly no patrol. And you get to the trailhead, the car park of the ski resort, first thing in the morning, and we learned very quickly that we needed to make alpine starts. We did not want to turn up at the trailhead of the car park at 8 or 9 o'clock, because it was just a complete bun show. It was kind of frightening what people were kind of going about and doing. People skinning up with Gucci handbags over the shoulders, in Ralph Lauren ski suits with furry collars, small children being pulled behind them on toboggans with the kids' skis on the backs, lots of people hiking with the downhill setups off into the backcountry. And initially at the beginning of the season, we thought, oh, there's going to be just a lot of these instances of fatalities are going to involve these people, but actually it didn't. They kind of self-regulated themselves. They go up the front side of the ski resort to a top of a run and ski back down, and what was and is a piste. And even though it wasn't a groomed piste, it was generally skier compacted and was perfectly safe. Very rarely would these complete amateurs and novices venture further back in these low resorts. The problem is in the higher resorts, when you're starting off at 9,000 feet, they're instantly into fairly challenging avalanche terrain. So this photograph here, for example, is we've set off at 6 o'clock in the morning. But remember, with the restrictions because of COVID, there's a curfew on. So even that is inhibiting what you might want to do in relation to your behaviors, to avoid other people, to give yourself a margin of time in the day, a margin of not having other people above you, and it's Hobson's choice. Are you going to break the law and go at 5, and go further, somewhere more remote, or are you going to be a good citizen and potentially place more risk in the mountains at your disposal? So these were decisions we were having to make all the time. But low down, again, below 8,000 feet, conditions were good. And at the back of these resorts, you'd leave the pink handbags and the toddlers in the onesies being pulled up on plastic sleds. And even though we were in resort, we were getting good rewards below 8,000 feet. We were getting great turns and safe turns. They felt really solid and safe turns. Little avalanche hazard present. Going back to what I was saying about that 8,000 foot area, 7,500 feet area where we were in the valley at that lower level, the basal layers were an ice layer. Higher up, there were faceted layers. So now the same snowpack at the same elevation as the last one you saw there, you can see this facet layer is already starting through temperature gradient and compression from above is starting to dissipate itself. It's starting to disappear, and we have a nice, safe, homogeneous pack forming here. And you can see just down here, no results from compression testing at all. A lovely, correct side up snowpack. And yet 50 miles further north, higher up, depth hoar is forming because this didn't have the opportunity to turn to ice early in the season. It stayed as facets, and those facets just continued to grow above that elevation. So below 8,000 feet, we started pushing into steeper, more committing lines, and it felt absolutely fine. We were getting good skiing, going right to the edge of where we could do in our 20 kilometer radius. Good rewards and good days around that Christmas, New Year period time. So this is where we are now, Christmas, New Year. And it goes very cold. It goes blue sky and cold for about a week, and we start picking up some nice big surface hoar, big feathery crystals on the top of our snowpack. And this surface hoar is widespread. It's not just below 8,000 feet, but further over in Switzerland, and then the higher mountains around Chamonix, the surface hoar has gone right up to 10, 11, 12,000 feet. So now if you think about their snowpack with the basal facets at the bottom and then a normal snowpack on above as a slab, now we're putting large surface hoar on top of that. Whereas where we were, we've got our ice at the bottom, our dissipating facets that are more or less gone, a correct pack that's the right way up with, look how big these feathery surface hoar crystals are. And for those of you who have taken a level 1, surface hoar is an extremely insidious weak layer. We talk about structural defects within our snowpack. And they would be a layer of less than 10 centimeters, a faceted grain type, a hardness difference, a size difference. Surface hoar generally ticks all of those lemons, if you like, those yellow flags that Ari talk about. Surface hoar is an insidious layer once it's buried. It's on the top. It's like skiing through broken glass. It's fine, it's fun, and it's not dangerous at all. You'll hear it. They refer to it over here, by some people refer to it as loud snow, because you can actually hear the crystals breaking. They're so large as you ski through them. But now we're going to put a new dump of snow on top of them. If that snowfall that comes in doesn't come in with a wind or with a warm temperature, that will knock them down. If they stay in that vertical axis, and we put a layer of snow on top of them, an extremely fragile layer that can collapse and initiate large avalanches, size 3 avalanches. So this was what was setting up. And sure enough, after a week of snow, we got a storm coming in, and you can see here the amount of snow we've had, because if you look at that photograph, you can see that's the new snow from the storm collapsing on that surface hoar. And this is a snowplow set that off a road cut. And then sure enough, higher up in the mountains above that 8,000 feet layer differential between the two different snowpacks, you're now having that step down to the depth. So we were running avalanche courses at the time. We managed to run, I think, we run a really limited program last year because of the restrictions. Were the courses going to go ahead? Weren't they going to go ahead? Could people travel to us? Couldn't they travel to us? We ran a handful of courses, managed to squeeze them in. And with that buried surface hoar layer, we were getting great results. It was fantastic learning. Here's a photograph of myself, and I'm just isolating an extended column test, and it's going as ECTV. That's an extended column test that's collapsed just on cutting. I've not even hit it with a shovel yet. I've not even waved a shovel in its direction. Just on cutting, it's popped straight out of the pit at me. And we were seeing some of the most reactive results we'd seen in years. So super exciting for us to get results like that. Great for the students to have to negotiate terrain like that, because with such a widespread avalanche problem on multiple aspects, terrain selection was super important to them. So it was great. They were having to choose very safe terrain, not being threatened above where they wanted to ski, keeping the angle down constantly under 30. Now, at the same time as we were running these courses, people were going up the lifts in Verbier in Switzerland, just over the border, just 50 miles away, and they went into a massive avalanche cycle, skier triggered, and they went into a whole bunch of incidents, skier triggered incidents, including multiple deaths. 7 deaths in the Verbier area and the Valais area, just over the border from Chamonix in a 10-day period, including 2 mountain guides. And it was interesting. Social media lit up. People were referring to black swan type events, and it was complete nonsense. So I'm the co-owner of Avalanche Geeks, and my partner just says, like, you know, so just don't say anything. Like, just bite your lip. And unfortunately, it's not in my nature, and I was just like, I was biting my lip and biting my lip, and eventually I just kind of responded on social media. And it's like, this is not a black swan event. You have depth hoar. You have slab of snow above it, and you've got surface hoar with storm snow above that. What do you think is going to happen here? You've got a pack of cards that are just teetering on the brink, and of course you're going to have a widespread avalanche cycle going on. nothing else is going to happen after you have 20 millimeter surface fall and a 2 foot of snow on top of it. What do you think is going to happen? And is that going to step down to your depth fall? Occasionally it will. And you will see large avalanches. So the behaviors around this storm cycle were very, very poor. And SLF, the Scottish, the Swiss Avalanche forecasting service, were calling the same thing. They were forecasting high, and they were talking about a very deep persistent slab problem with 4 millimeter size depth form, a 10 centimeter basal layer of 4 millimeter size depth form, and above it was surface fall with storm size upright. It was being forecast. It was a clear loaded gun, and people were just throwing themselves at it. And here's an example of some of the pits that SLF were posting from around that time, a few days before. Look at this here now. So ignore the blue. The blue is from ram resistance. The gray is the hardness. Here's a crust here. Depth fall, facets below a crust, facets above the crust. A really unstable snowpack, all around that 8,000 feet mark. Over here, exactly the same. Different area in that valley, just over the border in Switzerland, exactly the same. Snowpack here is compared to the I was showing you from the lower elevations, just 50 miles further, two very different snowpacks. Just out of interest, the Swiss Avalanche surface, they score using the Rutschblock still. They don't use the ECT, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is that they've always done that, and that gives them a historical record. So you'll see the Rutschblock results here as 2s and 3s. This one over here is 5, and just it's kind of fallen out of favor, especially in North America, because it's such a slow test to conduct. But the Swiss really like it, and some of the stuff they've done shows that it correlates better with snowpack stability than an ECT. But it's such a slow test that you get no skiing done if you were going to go out and do it. But basically, that's we say any Rutschblock scores of 1 to 3 is associated with unstable conditions. So number 1 is isolating the block. Number 2 is just gently approaching the block. And then you stand on a large block and you weight it with your skis and see the quality of the shear. So if you look back, they were getting clean shears on just approaching the block, not surprisingly. And then they're also getting some harder failures, but also on clean shears. So a very suspect snowpack leading into that event of 7 fatalities in 10 days. So we went through that cycle, and then just a couple of days later, we woke up to Armageddon. So COVID's running rife throughout Europe. Restrictions are everywhere of where you can go. We're signing forms just to go to get groceries that we have to present to the gendarmerie if we get stopped out in our vehicles. And then we woke up to this. This is 10 o'clock on a morning on Chamonix High Street, and there's no filter here. It's just the sky is orange. The sky is blood orange. What's going on? What's going on is a sand event. And then what we're looking at here is a photograph of Europe. Just over here is the Alps. This is Italy with the boot of Italy, with Sicily down there. This is North Africa. And you can see all of this sand is blowing from the south, blowing north from the Sahara across the Mediterranean, and is coating the Alps in a layer of very fine sand, but quite a thick layer, like a 1 centimeter, a half centimeter, 1 centimeter layer. It's completely coats the mountains in this orange layer of sand. And that's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. How's that going to affect the snowpack? And I kind of initially, I didn't think it would affect the snowpack that much, because just a day or so later, it snowed on top of that sand and buried that sand layer in the snow. And I thought, wow, well, you know, if it's staying as orange on the surface, that's definitely going to affect how it absorbs heat and energy, and I can see that affecting the temperature. But now that it's buried, it'll be okay. But interestingly, some of the research that's come out of Italy, but also out of Colorado, where they get these dust events as well in and around the San Juans, is that these layers can be really problematic. They can really affect and change the temperature profile within the snowpack. And they continue to do that, even buried 20 or 30 centimeters. They can be that much underneath the snow of new snow and still be having an effect on the temperature gradient. And it's not very well understood on how and why, but the consensus and the evidence is coming through from studying these events. And there's just a couple of papers on it, but the consensus is that they form melt freeze crusts around them. And if you throw your mind back to what Don Sheriff was talking about yesterday, melt freeze crusts are a definite problem layer within our snowpack. We get faceting below them and we get faceting above them. They affect the temperature gradient. And sure enough, that's what started to develop. So after this snow event, nothing really happened. This melt freeze layer hadn't started to form yet. But by mid-February, we have above 8,000 feet, all three problems that are going to plague last season's snowpack. We have depth thaw, a persistent weak layer at the base of our pack. We have a melt freeze crust from a sand layer forming. And then we have modified behaviors because of the COVID restrictions. All three coming together to make an insidious snowpack and a lot of human avalanche involvements. We go high and dry around mid-February, but look at the bottom here, what I've said here. We have now, by mid-February, two distinct different snowpacks, one below 8,000 feet, one above. And that sand layer below 8,000 feet has come onto a very hard, homogeneous snowpack that's set up. Also, almost an isothermal snowpack below that sand layer. Whereas above 8,000 feet, there's a lot of cold, soft snow with facets dotted around it underneath that sand layer. So a really messy, complex snowpack above 8,000 feet, but quite simple snowpack below. So it went high and dry, we started going out and we started seeing almost straight away avalanching on this sand layer. Well, that's interesting, but I guess it's just shedding some of this newer snow now that we're getting a lot of heat on there. And this day, we were heading in to ski these couloirs, and as you can see, our access path was looking pretty hazardous, and we just bailed on that day. And you can see during this 2-week period of going high and dry, this sand layer is starting to start causing snow to shed, starting to do kind of interesting things to the snowpack. We're getting liquid water forming in it because it's absorbing so much heat. That then in turn is freezing. So we're getting a melt freeze crust forming around this sand layer. It's already starting to do some interesting things in the first 2 weeks. So here we are, we go back to our timeline event. Below 8,000 feet, the snowpack has reset, but we have sand on top. But above, we have this really compact snowpack. There's our 10 deaths in 7 days in and around the Verbier area. And we're getting bits and pieces of activity coming through, again, above 8,000 feet. The snowpack is very benign below 8,000 feet. And after a couple of weeks, storms start coming back in, but nothing unusual where we were. In those lower mountains, where we're spending a lot of our time, it was just business as normal. Wind events, snow events, nothing unusual. And we kind of start to forget about that sand layer. It's like, well, you know, it's buried and we'll see what happens with it. But I wasn't really particularly concerned about it. We're just going on with business as usual, just getting out and getting great rewards. Low down, the snow was good. Stability seemed really good. We were getting after it and having some fun. But around that time, around mid-February, they started to loosen up some of the restrictions on travel, and we can go a little further away. And I was really keen to see the snowpack above 8,000 feet, right? All of these involvements on the Swiss side and high up in Chamonix, people were getting caught and carried. It's like, right, let's go and have a look at some of this now that I can move further away. So we traveled to the ski resort of Tignes, still in the Northwestern Alps. And this is a much higher resort. Very similar skier profile than Verbier, where all of these fatalities have been occurring, in that it's a hardcore ski area, lots of pro skiers, strong recreationists, seasonaires, people that go out and ski a season, take a year out. It's a high mountain resort. And unlike some of the terrain, or most of that terrain that we've been skiing sub 8,000, instantly you're into challenging to complex terrain. There's very little simple terrain to choose from, straight into it. Its lowest elevation is 8,700 feet and extends up to 10,500. So straight away, quite a different skier profile and snowpack profile. It was interesting. We spent just a day there and watched somebody get avalanched. This data code here is the avalanche that we witnessed above us. Soft slab, artificial skier, unintentionally triggered, a small pocket of wind slab that popped out. And yeah, a couple of 20 centimeters overnight, and instantly we're starting to see much bigger kind of terrain and the avalanches coming from that, and behaviors around that were pretty surprising. This is unmitigated terrain, no ski patrol, and some pretty alarming behaviors, people skiing it. The girl who set this off was skiing by herself, clearly a very good skier. And as she was traversing in, I said to my ski partner, I don't just watch where she's skiing. And sure enough, released above us, we were straight up onto a ridge, didn't quite reach us. And I just went up and had a chat with her, and she was French. She was like, but it's just a small slope. And I was like, well, I'm kind of like glad. I don't really want to be with you when you set off a big slope. Yeah, interesting kind of behaviors going on around there in and around Tignes. And there was another 50 centimeters forecast to come in that night and stormy, and really sort of had a good dig about and found some of those lower basal facets. And we were like, you know what, I'm kind of happy going back down to 8,000 feet and skiing below that. There's another image of it there. So you can see all the skier tracks there. And she's just pulled out this pocket. These are pretty old ski tracks. She's traversed out here to get some clean snow above us, and then popped out this slab. It's chased her down. She's kind of skied off out to the side of it. Yeah, so we kind of went. We kind of had a sniff around in that high elevation, and there was nothing there that really was appealing to us. We were quite happy to stay below 8,000 feet, really, for the rest of the winter after that. Big storms rolling in, getting good rewards, great ski rewards below 8,000 feet. no problem at all. Low down, we've got the advantage of trees for contrast, so storm skiing was really good. The Gucci handbag set wasn't coming out on storm days. We're getting great rewards. No need to go high. Bear in mind, travel restrictions had eased by then. You could move around further afield, but people were still pushing up into the higher terrain instead of going for that lower elevation terrain. We were getting good results. We were getting good skiing, good rewards, low down, and we were just quite happily lapping away that for the rest of the winter. And then as spring starts to develop, our latitude here is pretty low down. It's kind of similar to Utah. So, you know, by middle of late March, we're in full spring conditions here. Yet still in above 8,000 feet in that Verbier area, multiple avalanche deaths occurring, people just constantly going out and pushing into that horrible snowpack. Lift access above 8,000 feet. And now that sand layer for sure has set up as a melt freeze crust. And the Swiss forecast is definitely saying, they're talking about wind slab coming in, they're talking about the basal faceting, but they're not talking about that sand layer. And that's kind of interesting. This was a post that I put out there in our social media, because we were digging around and finding facets growing underneath that melt freeze sand crust and getting quite reactive results from it. And again, in the profile, this is the melt freeze crust from the sand layer with facets below it. This other profile again, here's the sand layer, facets below it. And even below 8,000 feet, the red line here is the sand layer, and we have facets above it. Look at these tests here. We're getting compression test 18 with planar results, resistant planar results on the 21st tap. Not getting propagation on extended column tests, but getting a vertical collapse in and around that melt freeze crust from the sand layer. And below 8,000 feet, that sand layer is on a very hard, homogeneous snowpack. So have a look at that, see what that actually looks like now in the pack. Multiple melt freeze crusts and then large facets growing underneath that crust on top of that sand layer. You can see how conspicuous it is, very easy to find in the snowpack. You can actually see the crystalline faceted forms just on top of that sand layer there with a crust just above it that they're growing underneath. Video doesn't play very well on Zoom. Let's see if this works. I don't know if you'll be able to see this or not, but it's kind of...
You can see where it has partially collapsed. It is on this sand layer. And the problem is just above that sand layer, we've got these loose facets you can see popping out here. So hard to initiate. Some places we're getting propagation, other places were not, so mixed results. It's a bit of a mixed bag, and this is what that is harder snow above this storm layer here, and then a bit of older snow, and then a melt freeze crust. And under that melt freeze crust, we've got about a 5 centimeter layer of facets, pretty small facets.
I don't know if you could see it. I don't know how well that played, but you could see that those facets and how loose and granular and sugar-like they were on top, directly on top of that sand layer. And then we got caught by it right at the end of March. So full spring diurnal conditions, and we went off to ski a southwest aspect below 8,000 feet. And in the afternoon, and we kind of went a little too late in the day, really. Friends had skied this line the day before, said they got really good spring corn conditions. We had a leisurely start, and we're going to ski this slope here. And you can see our friends' tracks from the day before. Second skier on a little steep rollover initiated a soft slab avalanche. We were kind of expecting wet loose because we were so late in the afternoon, and we were thinking, well, that's a very manageable problem. We'll work terrain, we'll ski one at a time. We'll be mindful of being sloughed by wet loose coming in behind us. The second skier down popped off, size 1.5 avalanche there. And you can see from this photograph, we're on this sand layer. It's initiated and gone on those facets on that sand layer. You can see that the slab above the sand layer is performing like spring snow. It's nice snow, but just further down in the pack, a couple of feet down, you can see the extent of the crown wall here, a couple of feet. There's that sand layer, and it's a really cohesive slab that's formed on top of it. It's another aspect from it there. You can see the color of the sand in the snow. So how to mitigate against that? We figured that we'd probably be able to manage it by going earlier in the day and just getting the soft snow on top of it. But we were certainly spooked by that. The skier was absolutely fine. He got carried on his backside for about a couple of 100 feet and popped up and managed to get back on his skis and skied off to the side. He wasn't buried at all. So our management strategy for that kind of meant we were getting up really early in the mornings, kind of breaking curfew by an hour or so and trying to get to that trailhead super early so we could hit our descent just as the top layer was just turning soft, hopefully not having any water percolating down to that sand layer interface, and just keeping our elevation below 8,000 feet. Again, we're creeping into bigger terrain, but just mindful now of that sand layer and what it's doing underneath us. We were not wanting to be on these slopes with any chance of any liquid water percolating down to that sand layer, and we're looking as much as we could for sub 30-degree slopes as well. Certainly slopes with cleaner runouts. This was probably the biggest, most consequential run we did all season, and yeah, right in the back of my mind, I'm definitely thinking about that sand layer. We're 4 hours earlier in the day here. This is just after 10 o'clock and the snow's just turning. And yeah, that sand layer's got me pretty freaked, I have to say. So here we are now, coming to the end of the season. And yeah, now check all of this out here. So we're coming up to another major cycle, and look how this coincides with a cold storm and the end of restrictions in France, and they opened the cable car up to 11,500 feet in Chamonix. So yeah, strong winds at elevation leading to unusual loading patterns, and which is always a concern, right? Because anything anomalous is, for me, is definitely a kind of a red flag. We don't like anomalies, and for sure that sand layer is up there as well. That's anomalous. were twitchy about that. Now we've got a big May spring storm with very strong winds. And those basal facets have persisted all winter long. So now you're opening the first lift of the season, right at the end of the season, after this big storm. And a large avalanche cycle has gone off. Classic ski runs that are normally skier compacted are avalanching. Again, guides are being involved. 2 guides died on that day in 2 separate incidents. One a mountain, both mountaineers. Neither of whom were skiing. They're out mountaineering trips. Hard to get the scale from these photographs. These are all both these photographs are size 3. Right? It's a size 3 avalanches. Large destructive avalanches stepping down onto those basal facets. Yeah. And interestingly, while everybody was desperate to head up those high altitude open lifts, conditions low down were really, really good. Yes, that sand layer melt freeze cross is a concern, but there's no lack of cover. We're moving to cold snow on the north, nice spring snow on the south, and empty mountains. There was no shortage of good quality ski rewards below that 8,000 feet threshold. No shortage of them at all. And that's how we finished our season off. We didn't go high. The only time I went high all of last season was that trip to Tignes, and that was enough, really. I saw enough from just that one day above 8,000 feet to say that I should keep below 8,000 feet, and so did all the people I skied with. There was no lack of rewards at below 8,000 feet. We just saw out our season. And this kind of photograph concludes the season, really. So this looks like a quaint mountain hut, but this is actually what would normally be the last day of the season. And this is a bar that normally has people dancing on tables and drinking champagne out of the bottle on the last day of the season. And you can see the big PA system there that's usually boom, bop, boom, bop, boom, bop across the mountain as the resorts in the afternoon and the resorts there. And here we are on this May day with the only 2 people on the entire mountain skiing really nice spring corn. And that's how we saw our season out, a very unusual season. Yeah. Thanks for listening, and yeah, open for any questions. I think there's some interesting correlations here between maybe what went over here in Europe and the season you guys had over on the East Coast there.
Really, really great presentation, Mike. Thank you. I think Blake probably can wrangle a couple questions for us.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. I really, so we got a question here from Kyle, and really specific. It's a good one. Starts off, hey Mike, great talk. As someone who lived in Switzerland the past 4 years, this past year was certainly different and more challenging than others in the past. After seeing the sand layer well into the spring, I started to wonder if the sand was causing an air-snow interface due to the granulation of the difference in grain properties of the sand compared to snow crystals. Do you think this could be a cause for the unstable conditions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I said there in the lecture, when it first came down, I kind of dismissed it very quickly because I just figured, well, you've got that albedo effect. It's going to soak up a lot of heat, but it got covered really quickly. And it was only later in retrospect when I started reading some of the scientific papers on what it does. And there isn't even many of those. There's just 2 of those. The main problem is that the commonality of both of these papers is it changes the temperature profile around that sand layer, it's not necessarily the sand layer itself. The sand layer does suck a lot of heat, and it is doing something we don't really understand while it stays in the snowpack, because it continues to do it once it's buried. But the bottom line is that doesn't matter. As practitioners, all we need to be mindful of is that is setting up a crust, a melt-freeze crust within that snowpack. And we know with all melt-freeze crusts, we think back to what Don Sheriff was talking about yesterday, they are all, melt-freeze crusts are a problem in our snowpack. They will grow facets underneath them because they're a barrier to that vapor transport out, right? Because of that temperature gradient, they'll not only grow facets beneath them, they'll grow facets above them. And certainly where we were in France, you saw those. Did the video play? Did that actually work? I don't know if that, could you see the video? Yeah, so you could see there was like a multiple sandwich. It was of cross, and then you had all those facets there. So ultimately, you can overthink that sand layer, but it's creating faceting in the snowpack, and you're getting a hardness layer because the facets are really, really soft. The big crystals, think about all of those yellow flags and yellow lemons. They're against a hard, icy layer. You've got a great interface for an avalanche to occur on.
Awesome. Thank you. Pat, do we have time for one more, or?
You're muted there, Pat.
Yeah, you're muted.
Oh,
yeah.
sorry. Okay. Yeah, let's do one more. And Mike, if you are able to stick around, and there's a couple questions that are in the Q&A that maybe you could answer about weather resources for looking at weather data in Europe. I know that's a little bit different than it is in the US. So those might be good questions for there. Let's do one more. And by the way, I was muted, but really, really great presentation, Mike. Thank you.
You're saying, I think it went a little long. I'm kind of sorry about that.
Sorry.
No,
all right,
it's
here
all
we
good.
go. Last question. In your area, where you have 3 countries in the same mountain range, how are rescues organized, and are there ever conflicts over who executes it?
You know, no. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, I do a lot of skiing in North America. I spent about half my season in North America and the other half here in Europe. And part of the problem that we have here, and part of these behaviors that you're seeing from the skiers here, is that the rescue services are outstanding. They're ridiculously good. They're extremely well resourced. It's all helicopter. It's virtually all helicopter based, but super slick, super coordinated. Generally, so I refer to the PGHM, which is the Patrol of the Mountain. The mountain. It's the gendarmerie, the mountain gendarmerie. They're a quasi-military organization, and yeah, it's full-on military grade rescue. They coordinate extremely well between the two of them. They'll actually go over borders to assist each other. You know, in the summertime, they're just flying around constantly, and there's multiple birds in the air rescuing people. They'll rescue 4 or 5 people a day up and around the Mont Blanc region, no problem at all. Sometimes more. On a nice sunny Saturday in July, 10, 12 rescues from alpinists is not unusual. It's on a completely different scale to North America. The Swiss are extremely good. The Italians are extremely good, and the French are extremely good. Yeah, I'm not particularly a Europhile, but they have it completely dialed over here. Yeah, the guides all have direct line phone numbers to those helicopter services. There's generally cell reception all over these mountains. All guides carry secondary comms around here as well. So if you fire up an inReach, you will have a resource to you. Generally, if the weather's good, the birds are flying and they'll be with you in under 10, 15 minutes. That's the kind of response time you're looking at.